Good afternoon. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education at the National First Ladies Library, located at the National First Ladies Historic Site. We are a friends group connected to the National Park Service, and we present programs related to the First Ladies of the United States and exhibitions at the National First Ladies Historic Site. And we are super excited to have you joining us today for our monthly legacy lecture series. Before we get things started, I want to encourage you to use the chat if you have any questions for our speaker today. Or if you just want to check in and share with us where you're connecting from. We also have some links that I will try to throw in related to our Eventbrite programs. So you can connect to our upcoming programs here, as well as some links we will send out after today's talk. This talk recorded via our YouTube site, as well as a reading list that our speaker has shared with us. So before I get things started, I wanted to mention our upcoming programs for the month. We are, now that Halloween has finished and we're into November, we have some holiday programs up our sleeves, and we're really excited about it. So hopefully you can join us next month in December. We are going to have a legacy lecture focused on Christmas. Once again, we will be joined by Colleen Burke, who has written an amazing book about the First Ladies decorating the White House for Christmas. And if you're familiar with the topic, you know that they start as early as the Christmas decorations are put away, planning for the next year. So it's a huge undertaking. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of iconography and stories behind it. And this year, we're going to be focusing on two First Ladies for our legacy lecture next month. And that is Nancy Reagan and Jackie Kennedy. So we're super excited about that. We hope that you can join us. These women are really the grand dames of decorating and celebrating the holidays at the White House. So Jackie helped to establish the themes and got the holiday decor going. And I think Nancy really picked up that tradition and added a lot of celebrity and glamour to it. So we hope you can join us for that. We also have two discussion programs. One is on Tuesday, November 8th, Election Day. We are going to be chatting about a film, a documentary that you can screen via Canopy, thanks to our partners at Stark Library. The film is about Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman to run for vice president on a major party ticket. So we're very excited about that. We'll have a special speaker from the University of Akron joining us. So you can still register for that. And if you are out of state, we are sending out links in the coming days to the film. If you are in Ohio, you can screen it right away. Or if you are connected to Canopy via your local library, you can do that whenever you'd like. We also have our book discussion, which is going to be taking a look at a really amazing book about Lady Bird Johnson that recently came out, and that is at the end of the month. As well as December 15th, our Talk with a Curator program is going to look at Clinton Christmas cards. Last year, we looked at Barbara Bush. So this year, we're going to take a deep dive into Hillary Clinton and Christmas card designs. So those are some upcoming programs that we have coming your way, and there are even more. So please connect with us via Eventbrite. We'll put that in the chat. We also have Michelle Gullion, who is our Director of Collections and Research, with us in the chat. So I even see some questions already. Some of them are about the site or the organization. If you have questions for the speaker, you can put them in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A. We will try to monitor our Facebook, but we can't always get to that. But Please share any questions you have with us, or if you need to troubleshoot the AV. I know sometimes people have trouble connecting to the Eventbrite. That's why we try to give you lots of different opportunities to watch with us and connect with us. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our speaker today. And I am going to, whoops, carefully ask him to unmute, ask to start his video. So our speaker, Dr. Ludwig Depesch, is a retired physician pathologist who lives in Phoenix, Arizona. He is an emeritus professor of pathology at the Northeast Ohio Medical University. So he is truly a Renaissance man, because not only is he a physician, but in retirement, he obtained a master's degree in American history from the University of Arizona and authored 3 books. The most recent is The Women in the Life of Andrew Jackson. And I was just teasing him that when I was sharing this on social media, I said, if you like the Real Housewives, you'll really love this story, because it is quite a juicy story from history that involves a hostess that is sometimes overlooked. So I am very excited to have Lud here with us. He is a great friend of the National First Ladies Library organization. And Lud, I want to welcome you. I'm going to mute myself and stop my video, but share your PowerPoint, which I am going to be controlling.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. I'm speaking to you from my home in Scottsdale, Arizona, where it is 65 degrees and quite pleasant. I want to thank Allison for organizing me in the use of PowerPoint. I want to thank Michelle Gouillon, a great friend who invited me to this lecture, and of course the First Ladies Library and Museum, which is a great site for researchers delving into the lives and biographies of American First Ladies. Well, to get started, I also want to thank my grandson, Nicholas Iwanski, who helped me put together the PowerPoint. For us older guys and older people, it is especially a great benefit to have grandchildren who know all about this stuff, which I do not. The topic today is Emily Donelson, the surrogate First Lady and defiant niece of Andrew Jackson, and we'll discuss what a surrogate First Lady is. Next slide, please. There were 6 women who were pretty significant in the development of Andrew Jackson, beginning with his first wife and with his mother, Elizabeth Jackson. She was a single mother. Andrew Jackson's father died before Andrew was born. He was born in 1767. He grew up pretty much as an orphan from the age of 13, because 2 of his brothers died during the Revolutionary War. His mother taught him many things, which an important one was to hate the British. Also prominent in his life is Rachel Jackson, pictured here. She was his helpmate. She presented him with many gifts, which, as we'll discuss later, was the gift of her Donelson family. She and Andrew never had children. I suspect it was Andrew's smallpox that prevented fertility with his wife, Rachel, since every one of Rachel's siblings had abundant families. The third person, next slide, please. Next, please, was Emily Donelson, much more later. The fourth individual, Margaret Eaton, also known as Peggy Eaton. She was a friend, not only of Andrew Jackson, but especially of his good friend, and also Senator from Tennessee, John Eaton. Sarah York Jackson was his daughter-in-law. I mentioned previously that Andrew had no children, but he had an adopted son. And the adopted son finally married, and this daughter-in-law was very, very important in his dotage to take care of him. And then Mary Ann Easton Polk was a favorite niece, one of many nieces that were significant social entities to Andrew Jackson. Next slide. Next, please. Here is Rachel Jackson, the wife of Andrew Jackson. She died in 1828, just subsequent to Andrew Jackson's election to the presidency in November of that year, but before his inauguration in 1829. She was one of 11 children of Rachel and John Donelson. Her father, John Donelson, was one of the founders of Nashville. She had been previously married to Louis Robards, a vile and possessive man, and she left him twice and developed a bigamist relationship with Andrew Jackson that wasn't resolved. In fact, it was never resolved. It was used as a thorn to Andrew Jackson's political life. Jackson reached Nashville without living parents or siblings, and Rachel gifted him with not only her companionship and her health care, and with her good feelings and generous feelings, but also with her extensive Donelson family. Her family embraced him. A brother-in-law married them. Others were justices of the peace, surveyors, landowners, and speculators. Several were soldiers. One nephew died under Jackson's command during the Creek Indian War. Business partners. Rachel's brother, Severn, he donated their adopted child when his wife, Severn's wife, wasn't able to raise the twins. AJ was a pater familias of nieces and nephews. Andrew Jackson Donelson, one of several that assumed his name. In fact, there are 6 or 8 members of the Donelson family that were named Andrew Jackson Donelson. Rachel died in December 1828 after his election, but prior to his inauguration. Next slide. Next. Emily Donelson was the 13th and last child of Captain John Donelson and Mary Purnell Donelson. Born on June 1st, 1807, John and Mary were neighbors of the Jacksons. Their plantation, called the Mansion, was only 2 miles and a short horseback ride from the Hermitage, the Jacksons' estate. Captain John was a great friend and political supporter of Andrew Jackson. Mary Purnell had borne John's children for 27 years. Emily Tennessee's names were from her mother's relative, that is Emily, and Tennessee from her father, who really loved his adopted state. On the day of Emily's birth, Aunt Rachel sat up and greeted her new niece at the mansion. In later years, Emily was a frequent visitor of Aunt Rachel at the Hermitage. It was at Aunt Rachel's home that Emily met, fraternized, and fell in love with her cousin, Andrew Jackson Donelson, who was raised as a ward of the Jacksons at the Hermitage. As the youngest of 13, Emily was pampered by her parents, John and Mary, and by her older siblings, her mother mistress of an active household and mother of many, taught Emily household skills and social amiability. Well-educated for women in the antebellum South, at age 10, she commenced education in a log schoolhouse, and at 13, at the prestigious National Female Academy in Asheville. However, sickness ended her formal schooling after 5 years. Emily was thought to be bright by those who knew her. One sister, Catherine, on the eve of Emily's wedding, wrote of Emily, "I know her to be more than ordinarily smart." But Emily was always afflicted with ill health. She was always fragile and a source of worry for her parents. Captain John withdrew her from school because of her chronic ill health. Emily feared that her parents would not allow her to marry her cousin Andrew Jackson Donelson 2 months after her 17th birthday. And so soon after her recovery from a winter-long illness, Captain John worried that she was too frail, slight of stature, and frequently ill to undertake the burdens of married life. Later, when Emily, not yet 19, was pregnant with her first child, Captain John, steadfast and stoic, he retreated into the adjacent Tennessee woods to wait out her birth by himself. I relied upon her biography, Pauline Wilcox Burke, her great-granddaughter, for specifics regarding Emily's appearance. Specifics regarding her height and weight were absent, other than comments regarding her being slender and being small of stature. She was a tiny mite at birth, slender shoulders. Her courageous soul was housed in a frail body and delicate from childhood. Next slide. She married Andrew Jackson Donelson. Andrew Jackson Donelson was one of 3 sons of Rachel's brother, Samuel Donelson. He also died early in 1805. Donelson was raised by the Jacksons at the Hermitage. He was born in 1799 and was thus 8 years older than his future bride. He was introduced early in her life because Aunt Rachel, being the proprietress of the Hermitage, was frequently surrounded by many young folks, many of whom were Donelsons, because her husband, Andrew Jackson, was often away in wars and business affairs or in politics. There was ample opportunity for Andrew Jackson Donelson to woo Emily. Under AJ's sponsorship, he attended West Point, and he also passed the bar exam. During this period, Andrew Jackson Donelson gradually assumed a pivotal role of secretary for his uncle's personal business. In summer of 1824, Old Hickory presented his nephew and niece with a crisis. when he wrote Andrew Jackson Donelson requesting his secretarial services in the nation's capital. Quotes, "I had no person to reply to but you. Next fall, I will have to bring you one with me to Washington. I had this winter at a great loss for someone to aid me." Therefore, the young Donaldsons were presented with this ultimatum: to marry or to separate. They chose to marry, married at the mansion in the fall of 1824. The Jacksons were very generous with wedding gifts. In Washington, D.C., Donaldson's honeymoon was spent on a weeks-long boat trip and carriage ride from Tennessee, first along the Ohio River, then upon the rutted trails of Pennsylvania and Maryland, and finally through the streets of Washington district to their lodgings in a boarding house managed by the genial William O'Neill. Andrew Jackson was a newly appointed junior senator from Tennessee and a continuing candidate in the controversial 1824 presidential election. That is Donaldson's secretarially and literary attitude had been kept quite busy by his uncle's strivings as a senator and presidential candidate. Andrew Jackson seemed to notice Emily only lately. His mention of her was only appeared in his January 18th, 1824 letter to her future husband. As he closed, "Present me affectionately to Miss E." The 17-year-old bride was meant to be the Washington companion of Rachel, Mrs. Jackson. However, the social elite, the ladies of Washington, D.C., realized right away that Rachel, General's wife, was reluctant to engage in the district's social life. But her very attractive and amiable niece, Emily, was more than willing to substitute as a member of the general's family. So young Emily partied at balls, receptions, and thereupon this teenager developed the associations and social skills that would assist her in a future role as the youngest surrogate first lady. Now, what is a surrogate first lady? That is one who fulfills the social, that is a woman who fulfills the social, ceremonial, and occasionally the housekeeping functions of first lady when the first lady was deceased, diseased, or uninterested. Over the years, many had fulfilled this role, although not since FDR's four-term presidency, where Eleanor Roosevelt was a political companion rather than an emotional companion to her husband, FDR. Emily Donelson was the third surrogate first lady. Dolly Mallison, who sometimes filled in on social occasions to support the widower President Thomas Jefferson, was the first. Eliza Hay often replaced her sickly mother, Elizabeth Monroe, wife of the fifth U.S. President, James Monroe. First Lady Louisa Adams, future First Lady, criticized Eliza as, quotes, "full of agreeable and disagreeable, so accomplished and ill-bred, so proud and so mean." Emily assumed the executive mansion's social and ceremonial responsibilities during most of Andrew Jackson's 2 terms. Many of the same commentators who had disapproved of Eliza Hay's function extensively praised young Emily, just 21, for her services to her uncle. Next slide. Now, I'm going to introduce another significant woman in this story. This is possibly a photo of Margaret Peggy Eaton, born in 1799, died in 1879. She was the daughter of the aforementioned prominent saloon keeper and hotelier William O'Neill. Andrew Jackson previously resided in one or another of O'Neill's establishments when he visited Washington in 1819 and in 1823 to 24 when he was serving as a junior senator from Tennessee, and more significantly in 1824-1825 with Emily along. Jackson became acquainted with Margaret on these prior occasions, was charmed both by her personality and by her intellect. The lady, Margaret, preferred to be addressed by a baptismal Margaret and never referred to herself as Peggy. However, in histories and biographies, Peggy is her identity, possibly since the less formal name captured her frivolity, informality, and insouciance. Also, this name had been used to signify her lower class origin, the daughter of a saloon keeper. She was born in O'Neill, married 3 times, and widowed twice. First to John Timberlake, a U.S. Navy seaman, then to Senator John Eaton, and lastly, and unfortunately, to a wasteful Italian dance teacher who drained her of her savings. Peggy was described as, in quotes, a born coquette with the added virtue of innocence. She was a natural flirt who was always far more at ease with men than with women, and one who always sought male companionship. Before she reached school age, she was described as being adept at handling men. Her social apprenticeship was served as a greeter and occasional barmaid at her father's tavern, where she entertained with her singing, dancing, and piano playing. Her dancing talent was such that as a schoolgirl, she performed at the White House, where Abigail Adams presented her with first prize medals. Her husband, John Timberlake, was away at sea for long periods of time. In his absence, this lonely wife was squired to social and cultural events around Washington by both Timberlake's friend, John Eaton. He was a senior senator from Tennessee, a frequent guest at her father's establishments, and most importantly, a very close friend and political ally of Andrew Jackson. What emerged was a social scandal. Even after Timberlake died at sea, probably from asthma, the scandal was intense and pervasive, particularly amongst the Washington elites. As a result, First Lady Elizabeth Monroe banned Senator John Eaton and his female escort, that is, Margaret, from visiting the White House. Eaton finally married Margaret just prior to Jackson's 1829 inauguration. Next slide. The Petticoat Affair. Now, this was an event. It was a cultural, but personal and mainly a political event that embroiled the Jackson presidency during the first 2.5 years of his first term. A petticoat was a separate skirt worn with the dress, not an undergarment. The Petticoat Affair was instigated and continued by the elite women of Washington, who refused to accept and furthermore to conspicuously shun Margaret, the wife of Jackson's Secretary of War, John Eaton, and also a friend of President Andrew Jackson, possibly due, at least in part, for class reasons. She was a saloon keeper's daughter, but moreover, she was bathed in scandal. In addition, the leaders of the petticoats were Florida, the wife of the vice president, John Calhoun, and also the wives of 3 cabinet secretaries, the secretaries of Navy and Treasury, and the daughters of the Attorney General. And also in this clique was Emily Donelson. What happened? Well, the consequences of the petticoat affair. Jackson spent an enormous amount of time to repair the damage to Margaret. He viewed her shunning as an attack both upon Rachel and upon him. The Jackson cabinet was dissolved entirely, with the exception of the Postmaster General, 2.5 years into the first Jackson term. John C. Calhoun, the husband of Florida, one of the elites who in the petticoat affair, he resigned as vice president and assumed the role of senator from South Carolina. Martin Van Buren, originally Jackson's Secretary of State, he also resigned in 1831 from the Jackson's cabinet, and Jackson appointed him as ambassador to the court of St. James in England. John C. Calhoun was still vice president when Van Buren was to be approved by the Senate, and John C. Calhoun had a deciding vote against Martin Van Buren, which was inconvenient to Van Buren that he had already moved to London and had to return. And lastly, and significantly important for this discussion, the defiance and banishment of Emily Donelson. Next slide. Next, please. Oh, here we go. Okay. Emily and Margaret, they disdained and even hated each other. Emily, 17, first met Margaret in 1824 when Jackson was a senator and presidential candidate. He had lodged his entourage at a hotel managed by Margaret's father. After 28-day grueling horseback and carriage and boat trip in 1824 to Washington from Nashville, Emily had a first view of Margaret. And this is how she pursued Margaret. A glamorous beauty, 8 years her senior, the mother of 3 children whose husband was absent at sea. His wife, a woman of 25 who had been used to the rather free atmosphere of a tavern all her life. Next slide. Margaret's view of Emily in 1824. Frail young thing, Titian-haired and lovely, but in use the ways of the world, unsophisticated and totally unfit, in her opinion, for the complicated social conditions of the capital city. There was instant antagonism between them. Next slide. This antagonism continued. In 1829, the previous quotes were from an 1824 introduction. In 1829, 5 years later, when Jackson arrives in Washington as president-elect, the Eatons, Margaret and John, as was their custom, call upon the young Donelsons. Emily returned the call, but Margaret publicized it. Emily was disgusted over this attempt to ingratiate herself and could not think of visiting her again. Emily concluded that Mrs. Eaton had a bad temper and meddlesome disposition, which had been too much increased by her husband's elevation, that is, to the Secretary of War by Andrew Jackson, to make her society too disagreeable to be endured. A short time thereafter, at the March 29th, 1829 inaugural ball, Emily accentuated her social distance from Margaret. She snubbed her together with Mrs. Calhoun at every occasion. Emily, immature and possibly a social climber, accepted the petticoat's aversion to Mrs. Eaton. An April letter from John Eaton to Emily was accusatory. She was young and uninformed in the ways of the malice of her new friends. A second letter by Eaton was patronizing, insinuating that she might suffer the same fate as Aunt Rachel. The Donelsons temporarily cut off any communication with the Eatons. The next event was on a Potomac cruise from Washington, D.C., all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay. The ship was a presidential yacht, also called appropriately the Potomac. Emily, on the boat, was pregnant with a second child, and she fainted from the heat. Margaret was nearby and, in a friendly manner, offered aid in the form of her fan and perfume bottle. Emily, with hostility, refused her aid. Margaret was understandably bitter by this embarrassing rejection. She realized that Emily's behavior was a significant public insult, which it was. Margaret had a brief conversation with Emily's husband, not too subtly threatened him to have the Donelsons removed from the White House. Margaret declined a future invitation to the White House. The lady who presides there was never friendly to me. She was always jealous of what she supposed to be my influence over General Jackson. I was always exceedingly careful about visiting the White House. Over the next year, Jackson tried mightily to resolve this issue, both externally with his cabinet and internally with his niece and nephew, but with little success. Emily continued to rebuff Margaret at social affairs during the winter of 1830. Jackson could not get his cabinet officers to acknowledge her. The rebellion infected the White House, since Emily refused any attempt to defuse the situation. Jackson considered the petticoats an attack upon him, both political and personal. He considered Emily and Andrew Jackson Donelson's recalcitrance disloyal, despite all he had done for the young couple, and repeatedly quoted, "A nation that stands itself cannot last," sometimes introducing a family that stands itself cannot last. The Jacksons' entourage summered 1830 in Nashville. The Donelsons refused to live at their hermitage because the Eatons might reside there for that summer. And they spent the time at the mansion with the Donelson family. This was too much for Andrew, the president. He banished Emily from returning and even sought a replacement for Andrew Jackson Donelson as the secretary. Next slide. Well, the petticoat affair was resolved in 1831 by the little magician, that is Martin Van Buren. He and Eaton resigned from the cabinet and persuaded the president to fire Ingham, Branch, and Berrien to resign. They said they resigned, but they actually were fired. John Eaton, taking perhaps some significance or something from Andrew Jackson's belligerence, he challenged both John Branch, Secretary of Navy, and John Berrien, the Attorney General, to a duel. Neither were in Washington, D.C., so they rejected the challenge. However, Samuel Ingham, Secretary of the Treasury, was. Ingham refused to accept the challenge to a duel with John Eaton. So if you think things are somewhat crazy in DC the last few years, think of this. John Eaton, with his brother-in-law, Major Lewis, and several others, rode or walked down brandishing pistols for the better part of a day and night in front of the Secretary of the Treasury, in front of the Treasury building, where Secretary of Treasury Samuel Ingham was holed up. Fortunately, Ingham had the good sense to retreat to Philadelphia clandestinely, and nothing occurred. Next slide. Emily won. She returned as surrogate first lady in September 1831. Margaret was forced to leave Washington, D.C. for Tennessee, also in September 1831. However, Andrew Jackson was always kind to his faithful subordinates. He appointed John Eaton to be the first governor of the territory of Florida. And after that, he appointed John Eaton to be the ambassador to Spain, where Margaret achieved great success as being a close friend of the Queen of Spain, and had a great time. Well, Margaret and Emily never met again after 1831. But ironically, they did pass, their boats passed on the Ohio River while Margaret was returning from Tennessee to Washington, where she'll be, where her husband will be appointed ambassador, secretary of, what be appointed ambassador to Spain. On going downstream from Pittsburgh on the Ohio was the ship, the Sandusky. Emily aboard was going back to Tennessee to die. But when she was First Lady, she was described as strikingly beautiful, tall, slender, and a most dashing complexion, having bright red cheeks with very regular features, dark brown eyes, and a most graceful carriage. All who remember her agreed that she did the honors of the White House perfectly and was really one of the prettiest women that had ever occupied the position. She had the reputation of having used the best taste in dress. This is from her biography written by her great-granddaughter. Next slide, please. Emily, with a gift of familial sociability, brought Jackson only pleasure, as Jackson sat by the fireside surrounded by members of his family. Mary Macklemore, a grandniece, and also Emily's niece, soothed his nerves with her exquisite playing of the harp and piano. Mary Coffey, likewise, a Donelson and a niece of Emily and a grandniece of Andrew. She brought laughter from Andrew, as she gave her impressions of the giants of the nation, fighting their verbal battles on the floor of the Senate of the House. Emily ordered him around for the sake of his health, and her babies delighted him with their antics. I should say that Emily had 4 children. Three of the 4 were born in the White House, and the 4 godfathers were significant presidents. Jackson for the first and the third baby, Margaret Buell for their second baby, and James K. Polk, future President James K. Polk, for their 4th. Next slide. I'll skip over this a little bit. She also was caretaker to the president, caregiver to the president. Andrew Jackson was a very sick man. He harbored 2 bullets, one next to his heart and his lungs, and he had frequent bouts of coughing up of blood, known as hemoptysis. He also had lead poisoning, malaria, smallpox, etc. She and his daughter-in-law, they took care of the president in the White House. They use familiar remedies and maybe even have used quinine. The president, Jackson, was no hermit when it came to, it was not monogamous when it came to doctors. He was given care by the best doctors in Washington, D.C. One was Henry Hunt, who never obtained a medical school diploma. Another one was James Crowdell Hall. Crowdell Hall had the great distinction of being present at the deathbed of 3 presidents: Harrison, Garfield, and Lincoln. Fortunately, Jackson got out of town before Crowdell Hall was around to serve him on his bed in Washington, D.C. Next slide. Next, please. Well, I'm a pathologist, so I thought I would give you a slide. Emily Donelson was a sick and frail woman. She was afflicted with the White Plague of the 19th century, that is tuberculosis. She probably had it for many years, and that probably was the reason why she was frequently ill, both in Nashville and also in Washington, D.C. In fact, in 1834, she was asked, she decided not to return with her husband to Washington from their summer vacation in Tennessee because she was too ill. Jackson insisted that that his secretary return, and Donelson insisted that his wife returned. So they went back. But in 1836, Jackson's last full term as last full year of his two-term presidency, she was very ill, and she had to go back to Tennessee to serve out her last days. And in Tennessee, she was coughing up blood. And the reason for that is tuberculosis. This is a sagittal section of the lungs fixed in a formaldehyde preservative. And tuberculosis being an upper lobe disease, which leads to cavitation with falling out of lung tissue, blood vessels would feed into this and bleed. So when coughing would occur, the patient, Emily in this case, would often cough up blood, this being the bronchi and the trachea, etc. So she died in December of 1836. Next slide. Next. There she is. Actually, a very formidable woman, a stubborn woman, talented as the third surrogate first lady, and strong-willed and sure of herself to the point that she was able to defy her uncle and president, Andrew Jackson. So that's it. We might have time for some questions, since it is, let's see. We have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Lud. That
Well,
was
someone
great.
criticized me for showing that section, but I thought it was useful.
I love it. And, we were just having a conversation before about first ladies afflicted with tuberculosis. And it was really surprising to me to learn that Eleanor Roosevelt also died of tuberculosis.
Yeah, Eleanor Roosevelt did die with tuberculosis. It had been quiet for many years, but after in her widowship and after the president had died, she was afflicted with what is now called myelodysplastic syndrome, in which her aspects of her blood were deficient. White blood cells were diminished, red blood cells diminished, she was anemic, and her platelets were diminished, although she didn't have hemorrhage. She was very ill, required blood transfusions, and her immune response was deficient against tuberculosis. And so the tuberculosis was dormant, but it re-energized itself. And at autopsy, her lungs were full of tuberculous bacilli, which crowded out her white blood cells and the lymphocytes. So she had, I guess, immune deficiency at the end. because of myelodysplastic syndrome, the tuberculosis was rejuvenated. Also, Jane Pierce, the wife of Franklin Pierce, she was tubercular, but she survived it. She was also very, very thin and slender. However, she was a very depressed individual, not like Emily, who probably had TV for a long time, and she was buoyant, happy, sustained many people.
I wanted to ask you about, I was really curious about the legacy of names, because we talk about this and I'm always surprised about the way that names are perceived in history. So a lot of times we talk about Mary Todd Lincoln, but apparently Mary Lincoln was the name that she went by, specifically sometimes to separate herself from that Southern heritage. So when you were talking about Margaret Eaton versus Peggy Eaton and the way that she was discussed throughout her by her contemporaries, I wondered about the way that she was discussed today by historians. And as a historian, what name do you use in your book to discuss her? Is it based on who is speaking about her and what name, or do you choose to talk about her as Margaret?
Well, they talked about her as Peggy. There was a Peggy did have her autobiography published by, I forget which company, but after her death. But she did write it at the urging of several people, and it's called the autobiography of Peggy Eaton.
Mhm.
But she states in that book, even though the title is the autobiography of Emily, autobiography of Peggy Eden, that she didn't want to be called by Margaret and never referred to herself as Margaret. So I don't know if I answered your question, but could you could you expound on that?
Well, I was also just curious about your feelings about it. It really, the story is really riveting to me, with the power of women during a time period where we perceive that they don't have a lot of power to really move the government. And
Yeah, she had a fair amount of power,
Mhm.
Emily, and she stood up to not only Andrew Jackson, but to a future president, Martin Van Buren, who tried to persuade her or dissuade her from hostility towards Margaret Eaton. Emily was tough. I suppose growing up in a house where many people, I suppose, being the wife or the daughter of someone who bore 13 children, her mother was tough too. So she was able to get along with many people, and obviously did. And she was tough. She determined to marry Andrew Jackson when she was barely 17 years old, and take that long journey to Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C., as we know, can be a difficult place to be. Lots of clicks.
Oh, and Michelle is sharing with me, interestingly, that Sarah Polk didn't return that season to avoid the controversy of the Peggy Eaton affair. So Sarah, who's someone who was very controlling and powerful in her own right, sensed the controversy and stayed home.
This is Sarah Polk.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. Well, uh, one of Emily's, in fact, her good friend and favorite niece was Marianne Eaton. Marianne Easton, Eastin, not to be confused with Eaton, and uh, she married a member of the Polk family, a cousin of James K. Polk, and had something like 6 children with him, by him. Also died at an early age.
Lud, can you tell us, as we're wrapping things up, about your current research pursuits? Are you looking at another historic figure? Are you studying aspects of medical history?
Oh, well, it's kind of you to tell me that. The first book I wrote, and this is my master's thesis, was The White House Physician. And that included all the doctors from George Washington to the first few years of George W. Bush. Now it's been 15 years, and the White House physicians have been much in the press recently. The last couple of years have been very good to to this to an historian dealing with this project. So I'm writing the second edition of the White House Physician, second edition, and it's going to include presidencies of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and George and Joe Biden. So to be continued.
Interesting. So we will.
Yeah, I've been able to interview
Mhm.
every presidential physician.
Oh, another question that came up was I wondered, and some of the people in the chat were curious about um the Rachel and Andrew Jackson and their ability to have children. So I know in the past.
Okay, yeah, which is interesting because all of Rachel's siblings
Mhm,
had children. I
mhm.
think one other siblings might have died early, but others did. In fact, her brother, Captain John Donelson, had 13. And there were 2 other presidents of the first 7 that were childless: James Madison and George Washington. In George Washington's case, and also in James Madison's case, their first ladies had previously married, and both Martha Washington and Dolly Madison had children by their previous marriage. So the inability to have children was probably the problem of the president. And both George Washington and Andrew Jackson had smallpox. And smallpox, although absent from contemporary discussions, was a source of infertility in males. James Madison was small, and what can I say? I don't know what his problem was, but he was tiny as opposed to Dolly Madison, who was very prominent. And I don't know.
Well,
He was a bookworm.
well, thanks bringing all of your medical knowledge and your amazing knowledge about the Jackson administration to bring new light to Emily Donelson. This was a really interesting talk. The controversy is fascinating. I know in the chat, we've had a lot of interesting chat about it. So I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Lud for speaking today. If you missed part of today's talk, it is available via YouTube 24 hours afterwards. And please connect with the National First Ladies Library and the National First Ladies Historic Site to find out more about upcoming programs. So I want to thank Love Depesh and let everyone know. Have a wonderful day. And we look forward to our next program. Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Have a good